Amen. Amen. If you have your Bible, please open to Genesis 14. Chuck Swindoll, in his book on the life of Abraham, he says that Genesis 14 would make a great action movie. It has all the necessary elements of a great story, a riveting plot, a crisis, a villain. In fact, multiple villains here. It's got a hero, Abram, acts of daring. And of course, as in all good stories, there's a surprise twist in the end. And I don't know why somebody hasn't made a movie out of Genesis 14, but I agree. Of course, we don't know how much time passed between Abraham's separation from Lot and the events in this chapter. And by the way, for those of you who are new to this setting, I have decided to forego the name Abram and just say Abraham. His name is going to get changed here in a little bit, but for now, we're just going to call him what we're used to calling him. But Abraham's separation from Lot could have happened months earlier as well as years earlier. At least it was long enough for Abraham's trained servants who lived in his own house to grow to the whopping number of 318. Why so many servants in one man's house? Well, you got to get the context here. Back in the days before national governments were formed to make laws and regulations governing people and how we interact and treat one another, back in that day, people sought safety and security in numbers. The people joined themselves to powerful men like Abraham, voluntarily living under their protection. And what they did, they offered their personal service in exchange for community and for protection. In fact, in Genesis 14, verse 14, where it says that these men were born in Abraham's house, that doesn't mean that they were literally born under Abraham's roof. This is rather an ancient expression which simply means not purchased. They were not bought. Well, what does that mean, you ask? Well, the point that the author of Genesis is trying to make, and makes it very well, is that they were not involuntary slaves. These were servants of Abraham by choice. They were not slavishly bound to Abraham. Rather, they were participating in what we might call a business arrangement. Provision and protection from Abraham, this wealthy, powerful man. Last week we saw where he grew in wealth, silver and gold and sheep. And, Abraham is growing in wealth. And so these people joined themselves to him saying, you protect us, because you see, back in that day, they had what we call man raiders, man stealers. People stole people and enslaved them so they could profit from them. Wow. Well, they joined up with Abraham, and they did that in exchange for Abraham's protection and provision, in exchange for their loyalty and service to him. And the question is, why is that so important to this passage? Why did the author say that? And why are we emphasizing that today? Well, it's because what's happening in Abraham's house is in such stark contrast to what happens in the real world of that day. What's happening in Abraham's house is very much unlike the way the world was outside of people with a relationship with God. Powerful men grew more powerful through conquest. And that brings us now to the story here in Genesis 14. They raided their neighborhoods, they took their possessions, and they killed anyone who didn't serve their purposes, and even enslaved survivors. And that brings us to Genesis chapter 14. This is the cultural context for the story that we have before us today. Essentially, a coalition of kings from the east, led by Kedorlaomer, sorry, Sister Karen, for not preparing you for that, formed a single army and began to raid the cities and the nations around Canaan. The Canaanite Valley was filled with all kinds of nations and people, the Amorites and the Jebusites and the Perizzites and the Hivites and the Hittites and the termites and all kinds of ites back there. And Kedorlaomer got together and formed a coalition of 4 countries and their kings, and they began to raid, and they got people to submit to them. For 12 years, they had these cities serving them as vassal cities. What that says is that these cities paid taxes to him in exchange for his protection and for provision. That is exactly what we saw a while ago as we were talking about Abraham. Except, unlike Abraham, he was unfair, he was cruel, he was ruthless. And so 12 years into this, as the passage says in verse 4, 12 years into this, as the taxation increased and the burden of his rule became unbearable, a group of Canaanite kings, 5 of them, decided it's time to put an end to this distortion. And so in verse 4, it says that 12 years they served him. In the 13th year, they rebelled. The author really wants us to get the picture here. And now in the 14th year, Kedorlaomer, decided to teach them a painful lesson by brutally sacking their cities. Notice in verse 9, it says 4 against 5. 4 against 5. The author is giving us a lot of details here to understand what's happening. These are the 4 cities under the 4 kings who are loyal to Kedorlaomer. There, I got it this time. Kedorlaomer. And the 5 kings are the 5 Canaanite kings who are rebelling against him. And what the author, I think, wants us to see here is that the 5, the greater, are being outdone by the 4, the lesser. Kedorlaomer he's a force to be reckoned with. And the 5 kings, look at verse 10. It talks about the asphalt pits, the slime pits. This is down there near the Dead Sea in that region. And at the time, petroleum was beginning to seep up out of the ground and cause this gooey stuff. And they had these pits that they had to be careful of. And this was in Sodom. And what we're seeing here as they begin this conflict between the 5 kings and the 4 kings is that the 5 kings who have the slime pits in their region, when the 4 come in to raid them, the Canaanite kings, they end up falling into their own slime pits. And I think the author wants us to see that the 5, even though they're greater in number, they're not doing so well. They can't even use their own slime pits to their advantage. They fall in their pits and they're not having a good time. And Kedorlaomer is really whooping them. Verse 11, they captured Sodom. I'm moving quickly through these verses, especially through that section of the names that you and I can't pronounce. And verse 12, lo and behold, if you're watching your verses in verse 12, Lot and his family are taken captive along with all the other people who are captured. Thankfully, in verse 13, somebody broke rank, somebody escaped from the camp and ran back to the tamarisk trees down in Mamre, where Abraham lives. Abraham doesn't live on the inside of Canaan right now. Abraham is kind of out in the countryside. God has promised him the land of Canaan. He's not worrying about it. He's kind of off on the outskirts of town, minding his own business. And this young guy runs up to tell him what had happened. He'd known nothing about this war, but now he finds out not only is there a war, but his nephew Lot has been captured. In verses 14, 15, 16 gives us the details as to how Abraham responded. Essentially, Abraham gathers his 318 fighting men or trained servants, and he goes to the rescue. He goes to get Lot back. Notice in these verses Abraham's battle strategy. This is very important. He attacks at night because he knows that under the cover of darkness, after they had won the battle and they're celebrating, they have the booty, they have the spoil, and they're gone to bed, they're eaten and they're drunk and they're sleepy. And here he attacks at night when no one's expecting an attack from anybody. But not only at night, he attacked from different directions. He divided this company into sections, and they attacked from different directions to cause mayhem and confusion among Chedorlaomer's army. And they began to be confused and they began to run, and Abraham's men chased them and chased them and chased them. It says it chased them down to Dan. It chased them down to the way going down to Damascus. You have to think of the geography of the Middle East here. These are the people in Canaan. Canaan is where Israel sits now. Damascus is the capital of Syria. Think about Abraham's men running and chasing this army at night all the way down to the capital near the trade route near Damascus. This is over 100 miles. I read some commentaries that says this is over 150 miles on foot. Wow. In the process, they recovered everything that had been stolen, and Abraham took the spoil, he took Lot, he took Lot's family, and he brought them back. You know, this is more incredible than meets the eye at first reading, so let me help you here. This is the first war recorded in the Bible, the first conflict between nations. Chedorlaomer's coalition army numbered in the thousands. It is safe to assume that there were probably at least 1,000 people fighting here, or maybe many thousands. How does a group of men from a local guy's house, 318, beat and defeat an army of thousands of people? A few other men joined up with Abraham. You'll notice that down in verse 24, when they're going back home and the kings come out to meet Abraham, they list 3 guys from 3 towns representing 3 cities that had joined with Abraham to go after Chedorlaomer, because other people were concerned about him. But still, you know, add 10 people, you only have 320 or 30. This is a miracle. This is a miracle. Abraham's group, Abraham's fighting men should be no match for this large army, but they won. Might say it in the present tense. They win. They win. And this is the story of Gideon before the story of Gideon, those of you who know that story. So what we have in the remainder of the chapter is Abraham making his way back. He's going home. He's going to drop Lot off back in Sodom, and he's going to make his way back up to Mamre. And on his way home, two kings come out to meet him. And the author of Genesis describes Abraham's encounter with these two kings. I think he wants us to see the contrast between them. These are kings in contrast. In verse 17, the king of Sodom comes out to meet Abraham. And it's interesting that the author of Genesis, you don't get the details about this king till you go down to verse 21, because in the next verse, in verse 18, he tells us about a second king who comes out to meet Abraham, called Melchizedek, or Chezedek. Pick your pronunciation. Well, I think he wants us to contrast these two kings. Let me do the first one first, and then we'll come back up to verse 18. Down in verse 21, the king of Sodom, he wants to negotiate with Abraham. He says, "Hey, Abraham, congratulations. Thank you very much for helping us out. By the way, you can take the booty, you can take the stuff, and we'll take the people." Or maybe it's the other way around. I'm not looking in my verse. But either way, he wants one, and Abraham will take the other. And the issue is here, he does say, "Give me the people and you take the goods." The issue is that he has no authority to tell Abraham anything. I mean, they were running for cover till Abraham came and rescued them. Abraham had every right to take whatever he wanted to take. And he had 318 witnesses to that fact. But listen to what Abraham says. Abraham in verses 22 and 23, and I'm not going to read those two verses, but you're looking in your text, I hope. Abraham basically says, "I have raised my hand to the Lord," meaning I have taken a pledge, I've taken a vow, "and I will not take from you, I will not take a piece of thread. I won't take a thread nor a shoe strap from you." What's a shoe strap? A shoelace. A lace. Abraham is saying, I have taken a vow with God. I have a pledge. I've got something going with God here. He's going to make me rich. Abraham says, "I won't take anything from you, lest anyone says that he's made me rich, because there's only one person who will make me rich, and that's God." God's reputation is big in Abraham's mind, and that says a lot about Abraham. Abraham understands that a watching world, the world is watching. The Canaanite people are all watching him. He represents the true God. They have a pantheon of gods in Canaan. And Abraham wants to make sure that God's reputation is not tainted. When you come to a place where God's reputation is more important than your riches, you're in a good place. You're in a good place. Abraham is developing and forming character. So we come back up to verse 18, to the other king who came to meet Abraham. And he is Melchizedek. And he is the contrast of the king of Sodom. Very, very different. Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. And he was the priest of the Most High God. And he blessed him and said, "Blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hands." And he gave him bread and wine. The name Melchizedek means king of righteousness. The text tells us that. He's not only a king, he's a priest. He's a king priest, which is unusual. And we think of Jesus, who is prophet and priest and king, and he serves Abraham bread and wine, which are symbols of the communion table, the cup and the bread. Wow. Bread and wine. In Genesis 14, we have symbols of the communion. And Abraham pays him a tenth of all that he had taken, of all the spoil, a tithe. The concept of tithing goes way back beyond the laws of Moses. And the concept of tithing is a concept of stewardship. And stewardship basically says, God owns it all. How happy I am to give him 10%, especially when I get to keep 90%. Abraham paid tithes to Melchizedek. Now, we could go on and not say a word more about Melchizedek, except that you and I know, those of you who are students of the Bible, you've been around the church, especially Church of God Seventh Day, you know that speculations abound concerning who Melchizedek really was. He's seen as this mysterious figure in Scripture, and rightly so, because of two passages that talk about him outside of Genesis chapter 14. Psalm 110. Psalm 110, verse 4. This is a messianic psalm. The psalmist David is celebrating prophetically the coming of Messiah. In verse 4, Psalm 110, David says, "The Lord has sworn and will not relent. You are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek." Wow. The point is that Jesus Christ is our high priest. And the priests, those who served in the priestly service of the Old Testament, all had to come from Aaron, the Aaronic priesthood, through Levi. You had to be a Levite to be a priest. And David is trying to explain how come Jesus does not come from the tribe of Levi. He comes from the tribe of Judah, and yet he's a priest. And David says, because he's from a different order, from a higher order. And what is that order? From the order of Melchizedek. And if you want to understand the order of Melchizedek, you got to go to Hebrews chapter 7. Hebrews chapter 7. We're doing a whirlwind tour here in the few minutes that we have. And there's so much in Hebrews 7 about Melchizedek, and we'll skip over most of it. Look down to verse 4. Hebrews 7:4, "Now consider how great this man was, to whom even the patriarch Abraham gave a tenth of his spoils." Let me, since we don't have all day, and maybe someday we'll have a Bible study. How about that? Maybe someday we'll have a Bible study on Melchizedek. I'd love to do that. But you probably want to know what I think. Some people believe that Melchizedek was a mysterious appearance of Shem. Shem is the father of the Shemite people, the Semitic people. You see, Kedorlaomer, the group that he led were Shemites. Actually, Abraham was a Shemite from the tribe of Shem. I'm not sure about Kedorlaomer. I said that by let me scratch that. Abraham is certainly from the tribe of the Shemites, and here comes Shem to present himself to Abraham. Some people believe that Melchizedek was just a mysterious, unknown person who showed up. No one knows who he really was, and others believe that this is a theophany. Theos, God. This is an Old Testament appearance of God in human form. And some people believe that this is a Christophany. A Christophany, an Old Testament pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus Christ. I could live with that third interpretation. Although I tend more to believe, and those who believe that this is a Christophany, there's good reason to think that. I tend to believe, however, that Melchizedek was a man, just a person, a king, exactly what the text says. He's identified as king of Salem. Salem means peace. Salem, where's Salem? This is the city that David will later conquer from the Jebusites because he wanted to name a city for God. And David named it Jerusalem. This is where Melchizedek comes from. This is Melchizedek gloriously and incredibly and marvelously is a worshiper of the true God. Abraham had never met him. As far as Abraham knew, he was the only guy in the world worshiping the true God. And here comes Melchizedek from Salem, a city that will later become Mount Zion, the city of God. And Melchizedek says, "Blessed be thou, Abraham, the God of the Most High, possessor of heaven and earth." And he's using the word El Elyon, El Elyon, a biblical, a Hebrew name for God, possessor of heaven and earth. Melchizedek is saying, Abraham, around here, they serve the God of this and the God of that and the God of the other. We know you serve the God of everything, and I serve him too, and blessed be that God. This is powerful stuff. And I wish we had more time for me to linger here. But in the interest of time, let me just say that at the end of the day, Genesis 14 is not about the mystery of Melchizedek. You know, whenever people go to Genesis 14, at least in our circles, the big deal, their big interest is to figure out who Melchizedek is. Genesis 14 is really not about Melchizedek. It's not even about the kings who are fighting. Genesis 14 is a story about a man who is learning what life is all about. Genesis 14 is the story of a man who is in the school of discipleship. Last week we talked about Abraham being in the school of discipleship. Here he is. Remember last week we said that God has a broken world that he needs to put back together. Before God can put the world together, what does God have to do? He has to put the man together. And Genesis 14 shows us a man coming together, being put together by the living God. Abraham's heart has to be in the right place. Abraham's character has to be formed, and here we see it being formed in this chapter. Here are 3 life lessons I want to give you to help you frame. Let's make a triangle here around Genesis 14 with these 3 lessons. Number 1, the ultimate purpose of your life is to put the glory of God on display. The ultimate purpose of your life is to display the glory of God. You know, I thought about it this week. Let's say we lived in Canaan, you know, back in that day, the news, the daily news, Canaan Daily News. In fact, I came up with a CDN, Canaan Daily News. In fact, I thought of CNN, Canaanite Daily News. Well, that doesn't fit, does it? That's still CDN, but Canaanite Network News, CNN. But let's not get off on any of that right now. Let me just say that the news people in Canaan are trying to explain this war. You had this big war between 4 kings and 5 kings, and they're trying to explain what happened. And the 4 kings beat the 5 kings, and then here comes this guy from nowhere with 318 men, and they kill all these people, they beat them and chase them. Abraham's life is on display before the people of Canaan. Abraham's life is really a picture of the glory of God on display before a watching Canaanite valley of people. Revelation chapter 5, verse 11. And for his pleasure we are and were created. What is the whole duty of man? The Shorter Catechism asks, to love God and to enjoy him forever. Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8, 9, and 10. We're saved by grace through faith, and that not of ourselves. It is the gift of God, lest any man should boast, because we are his workmanship. We are his work of art. We are his trophy. What do you do with a trophy? What do you do with a work of art? What do you do with a sculpture, a painting, when you're done? Put it in your closet? No. You put it on display. Put it on display. The glory of God. God's glory. Our ultimate goal, our ultimate purpose in life is to display the glory of God. It's interesting when we look at Abraham going out after the army to defeat them and rescue Lot. We think of the quote by the first century church father, Irenaeus. Irenaeus said that the glory of God is man fully alive. The glory of God is man fully alive. Those of you out there who are raising young boys, those of you teenagers out there in Zoom land, wherever you are, you're mentoring some young fellow, and this applies to girls as well. Tell them the glory of God is man fully alive, fully alive. The second thing the second lesson that I want to leave you with today. This is prime, okay? So write this down. We must fight for the people and the relationships which God has entrusted to our care. We must be prepared to go to battle for the people and for the relationships that God has entrusted to us. Abraham has learned that. When God first called Abraham, God told him to leave his father and mother and everything and follow him. Abraham didn't quite do that. Abraham took Lot with him, and Lot now becomes Abraham's problem. Chapter 13, the conflict that arose, and now Lot lives down in Sodom, this ungodly place. And we saw last week how that our decisions have consequences. And now we're seeing the consequences of Lot's choice. All Lot could see were the fertile valleys of Sodom. And he went down there, and now he's in trouble. And Abraham is giving to Lot what Lot doesn't deserve. Abraham decides that there are some things worth fighting for. There are some relationships worth going to battle for. There are some friendships worth putting your neck on the line for. There are marriages that topple because people don't realize you need to go to war and fight for the things, the relationships. Talk about our children. There are those of us that Satan would destroy our offspring. He would kill our seed. And you need to go to war. You need to stop fighting with your children. and start fighting Satan to let loose of them. Some things are worth fighting for. Abraham knows that, and he puts himself in danger. He goes to battle to save Lot's life. Thirdly, you and I must cultivate great-heartedness. Great-heartedness. I told you last week that I read Chuck Swindoll's book last week on the life of Abraham. And in that book, the chapter on chapter 14, it's titled Abraham the Great-Hearted. Abraham the Great-Hearted. I never would have thought of that. I owe all of this to Chuck. And you remember last week, I told you that, when the conflict arose between Lot's herdsmen and Abraham's herdsmen, and Lot said, look around and look at all the land and pick your place, that Abraham didn't have to say that. Abraham could have said, no, this place was promised to me by God, and therefore let me check to see what little corner I could give you. But you see, Abraham has a great heart. Abraham said, I'm not worried. You look around. You take the right, I'll go to the left. You go to the left, I'll go to the right. Abraham is great-hearted. Let me tell you what he could say now in chapter 14. When the young man ran from the camp to tell Abraham that Lot had been captured, you know what Abraham could have said? He could have said, well, that's none of my business. I don't even live in Canaan. I live out here. I'm going to mind my own business. Abraham could have said, Lot, there you go again. If I keep bailing that kid out, he'll never learn. Abraham could have said, you know what? He made his bed. He's going to have to sleep in it. But great-hearted people don't talk like that. Abraham has a great heart. Chuck Swindoll in that chapter lists 4 qualities of great-hearted people. Let me give these to you real quickly. People with a great heart, number 1, have a genuine unselfishness when it comes to their possessions. A genuine unselfishness with regard to their possessions. Just take whatever you need. Number 2, great-hearted people have a willingness to sacrifice for others. When it comes to people, they're willing to sacrifice for other people. Number 3, great-hearted people, they have an absence of greed. They're not greedy. And that's the difference between Abraham and Lot. Lot is greedy. It's greed that gets Lot in trouble here now. Great-hearted people are like Abraham instead. And number 4, and finally, great-hearted people have a restraint of power. A restraint of power. They're not power hungry. They're not egotistical. They're not about me, myself, and I. They're meek people. And I've told you before that, meekness, unlike what many construe that to be, that meekness is weakness, the 2 people in the Bible called meek are Moses and Jesus. 2 people labeled meek, Moses and Jesus, and there's nothing about Moses and there's nothing about Jesus that's weak or a pushover. Rather, when we look in those 2 lives, we discover that meekness is power under control. Power under control. He could have called 10,000 angels to destroy the world, but he died alone to set us free. Jesus was meek. It's interesting in the Beatitudes, you and I are called to be meek, and that is the 4th quality of the great-hearted person. So I'm suggesting that every day for the next week or 2 or 3 or 4, you ask yourself, whenever you come to an intersection, whenever you come to a junction of life where life crosses you, ask yourself the question, what would a great person do? When you're up against the rubble of your mundane day and your routine life and you can't figure it out, stop and say, what would a great person do? How would a great person respond? In my role as a leader, I have to ask myself, what would a great leader do? As a pastor, Pastor George, what would a great pastor do? As a dad, what would a great father do? What would a great mom do? As a husband, this week I've had to ask myself, what would a great husband do? What would a great wife do? Of course, the reason, the question, the burden that we have now as we close is, how do I cultivate a great heart? How do I cultivate great-heartedness? I want to close by just making a quick suggestion here. The story is told of Michelangelo, the great painter, sculptor of centuries ago. He painted St. Sistine's cathedral there in Rome, laying on his back on a scaffold. It's one of the wonders of the world. And Michelangelo is also known for his famous statue of David, his famous statue of David. The story is told, and you can look up the statue of David and just Google it. It's amazing. And somebody asked Michelangelo before he died, how did you do that? How in the world did you conceive of that and carve that out? And Michelangelo simply said, well, I just took a slab of marble and kept chipping away at everything and anything that didn't look like David. I'm suggesting today that you and I need to surrender our heart to Jesus and ask him to chip away, to chisel away, to hammer away, to carve away, to shape and to mold. Reggie McNeil, I told you last week I'm teaching a class on spiritual leadership, which ended just a few days ago. And one of the books we're studying is a work of heart. Talked about a work of art. This is a work of heart, Reggie McNeil. Understanding how God shapes spiritual leaders. And here is the statue of David on Reggie McNeil's, the cover of Reggie McNeil's book. And in that book, Reggie McNeil talks about how God shapes people, how God shapes people's hearts. And he says there are 6 subplots to how God does that. Number 1, the subplot of the culture, the call, community, communion, conflict. God shapes our lives through conflict. Abraham here deals with a conflict. And then finally, he says the commonplace. Culture, call, community, communion, conflict, and the commonplace. Those are the 6 subplots by which God shapes our lives. And we see all of them in Abraham's life. But the one that I want to point to today as we close is communion. I think it's highly significant that Melchizedek, when he came to greet Abraham as Abraham made his way back home, that Melchizedek served bread and wine, the symbols of communion. Communion. Here's what McNeil says about communion. He says this aspect of heart shaping reflects the leader's continuous cultivation of a relationship with God. Spiritual leaders deal in spiritual currency. And the value of this currency depends directly in the strength of the leader's deposits into the relationship bank with the Almighty. The relationship bank of the Almighty, and these regular deposits of communion. The communion subplot opens the door to the infinite interaction between the leader, lowercase l, and the leader, uppercase L, our God, Jesus Christ. Abraham has a great heart, and it's going to become greater and greater because Abraham is learning to love God more and more. Brothers and sisters, Abraham is not perfect. In the next chapter, Abraham is going to have a crisis of faith, a meltdown, so to speak. I hope you'll be back next week. In chapter 16, Abraham is going to make a monumentally bad decision, listening to his wife and bad counsel. And we live today, the conflict in the Middle East between Jews and Muslims results from Abraham's bad decision. Abraham is far from perfect, but Abraham's heart is being shaped and is getting bigger and greater. And Abraham has a great heart, all because of communion, his relation. Everywhere he goes, he builds an altar. And by the way, what would he do now when he got back home? He would build an altar. But why doesn't he build an altar? Because Melchizedek shows up. He doesn't have to build an altar. Melchizedek comes not only with the altar, but with the sacrifice, bread and wine. Can you see that there's a little worship that goes on here? And do you see grace here? Abraham has gone out to battle. Like Jesus put himself on the line and went to battle for us. Abraham went to battle for Lot. Lot didn't deserve it. You and I don't deserve the grace of God, but that's what grace is. We don't deserve it because that's why it's amazing grace. You see worship. You see grace. You see love. The whole issue here is that Abraham loves Lot. Abraham loves Lot. Jesus loves us. The question is, how much do we love him? And so we're going to conclude our service today. We're going to sing along with Dennis Jernigan, a special song that is probably not familiar to some of you, but it's one that is well known by some of us older folks. A song that I used to sing. The words are going to be up there. It's very easy, very catchy. Who can satisfy? You know, I love John Piper's definition of love. He says, love is the overflow of our satisfaction in God that meets the needs of others at any cost to ourselves. And Abraham is satisfied in God to where he's no longer so worried about Abraham. He wants to go after the welfare of other people. And who can satisfy us? Who can satisfy our longings? It's the warrior king. It's our God. And Dennis Jernigan is going to lead us here. Sing along, worship where you are. And then we'll come back and have a closing prayer. Pastor George will lead us in the closing prayer. And God bless you now as we worship together in response to this word.